Joining us now to discuss the implications and Russia's war on Ukraine, the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, Ivo Daalder. Ivo, I should say, thank you so much for being with us this morning. We appreciate your time. Let's start with that call by Finland's president, who told Putin that the invasion of Ukraine has altered the security environment of Finland. He says the call was direct and straightforward and conducted without aggravations. How do you think Vladimir Putin took that message?
I don't think he took it well because, of course, one of the reasons that Vladimir Putin has said he needed to invade Ukraine was because NATO was coming too close to Russia's border. That was always an excuse for what he really wanted to do, which was to control Ukraine's political destiny. But if this was the real reason, he miscalculated spectacularly. Clearly, Finland becoming a member of NATO would double the amount of NATO border with Russia just in one fell swoop. And it would make Finland part of the Western bloc after years of being more independent. And when in the case of Sweden, 200 years of neutrality and non-alignment would end because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There, as well as in other places, like your reporter just mentioned, Putin is just not achieving what he was hoping to achieve by using military force, and that's a good thing.
Notably, the Kremlin threatened retaliation exactly for this kind of move, and there's an operator in Finland that's saying that Russia has cut electricity to that country already. What other retaliation do you anticipate?
You know, there's a possibility of a greater military buildup on the border with Finland, although Russia is running short of troops for its war in Ukraine. It could deploy additional military forces, as it has said, into the Baltics, including nuclear weapons, though I would note that nuclear weapons are already present in the Baltic, a part of Kaliningrad, a small outpost from Russia. And of course, in the north, the Kola Peninsula, which is north of Finland, is probably the largest concentration of nuclear weapons in the world. So I think what we're hearing is bluster that is meant to frighten people in taking the steps that they want to take. But in fact, that's not working. It's the very fear of Russia that is leading Finland and soon Sweden into the hands of into membership with NATO.
Given everything that you outlined about the amount of nuclear weapons in that region, are you concerned that as Ukraine is shifting toward a more offensive versus defensive stance, as these Russian troops are retreating, that Putin may find himself in a corner and may lash out in dramatic fashion, perhaps with the use of nuclear weapons?
Well, we have to be concerned, given the fact that Russia does have nuclear weapons, together with the United States, over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, and that Vladimir Putin, having so spectacularly miscalculated in this war, may feel that he needs to do something drastic. On the other hand, aside from the fact that nuclear weapons would cause extraordinary damage, the main result of using these would be to unite not just the West, but the rest of the world against something that hasn't happened since 1945. The use of nuclear weapons in war is something that hasn't happened. So he will have to calculate how much is the actual use of nuclear weapons going to change things for the better. In all likelihood, it would change things for not only worse for Ukraine, but very much worse for Russia.
And final question, if Finland and Sweden do become part of NATO, what does that do to Ukraine's chances of potentially joining the alliance?
Well, as long as there's an active war inside Ukraine, it's going to be very hard to bring Ukraine into NATO. But clearly, there is a recalculation of what it means to be a member or not a member of NATO. The Finns and the Swedes have decided that the lesson they learned is that they're less likely to be attacked if they are members of NATO. And I think the West is starting to learn the lesson that a country like Ukraine, left out in the cold, in a vacuum, is more likely to be attacked if it's not a member of NATO. So I think we're going to have a new debate once this war is over about whether Ukraine ought to be part of NATO. And many, including myself, would think that the time has arrived to take a very serious look at that.
Ambassador Ivo Daalder, thank you so much for walking us through all of that. We appreciate your time.
My pleasure.